Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nicholas Buellens. I am a program administrator at the Executive Office of Economic Development, or EOED. I also represent the Secretariat as a climate change coordinator on the Commonwealth's Resilient Mass Action Team. That's an interagency group responsible for implementation of the state's hazard mitigation plan. I want to thank you all for joining, taking the time today to participate. This is a really exciting project that we've enjoyed working on for the last several weeks, several months actually. So in October, the Healey Driscoll administration released the Commonwealth's new statewide hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, now known as Resilient Mass. This plan details over 100 actions that state agencies can take to ready the Commonwealth for the impact of climate change. And among these actions is the topic of today's event, which is a local guide for strengthening floodplain construction. So this project is a collaboration between several Commonwealth agencies, including EOED, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and the Office of Coastal Zone Management. Together, we're working to develop a resource for cities and towns to take impactful zoning, administrative, and other local actions to reduce flood risk at the local scale and to promote flood resilient construction in new buildings. Over the years, communities have expressed a lot of interest about doing this, about thinking outside of the box, going above and beyond normal minimums when it comes to building in the floodplain. Our goal is to try to make that easier for communities so you have a toolkit available so you can do that. From here, I'm actually going to hand the reins right over to AECOM Technical Services because I want to leave plenty of time for opportunity to discuss and participate in our polls. Please know that the slides you see today, they're going to be made available online a few business days from now, and participants are also going to receive a follow-up survey via email, so you can share as much feedback and additional information as you'd like, which we'd love to receive. So, Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Let's try that again. Can you hear me this time? Next slide. All right, so like Nicholas mentioned, here is our project management team. It includes the EOED, EEA, DCR, and specifically the Flood Hazard Management Program and the CZM office. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about that local floodplain management action guide. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the project, talk about the purpose of today, and then we're going to dive into the actions that could be included in the guide. Next slide. So the local floodplain management action guide is being developed to provide communities actions that they can take to improve floodplain management standards and promote flood resiliency. We started the project by reviewing roughly 40 publications on higher standards for floodplain management. From that research, we came up with a list of possible options, some of which we'll talk about today. And then the second piece of that project is to get input from you. So that's what we're doing today. We want to see and know what you want in the guide. We want to hear about your success stories and implementing actions. And then even if you've tried actions that didn't work. So we want to get your guys' input today. That's really the big piece. Before we jump into that, though, I want to talk about the criteria that must be met in order for those actions to make it into that guide. Next slide. So for this project, we're looking for actions that can be accomplished without conflicting with the state building code. As many of you know, the state building code governs the design of buildings. For example, how high they must be built, how they are flood-proofed, what materials can be used, and so on. Now, the building code options are being looked at, but they fall into a separate project, and that will be presented for feedback, ideas, and suggestions in the future. Next slide. So the second criteria was, will it hold up to climate change projections? So looking at the statistics for the group today, we have 39 communities within the Cape Islands and South Coastal region. We have 658,000 people, 317,000 residential properties. And the climate change assessment identified the most urgent impacts, flood-related impacts in the Cape Islands and South Coast region as reduction in state and municipal revenues, including a reduction in property tax base due to coastal flood risk, reduction in the availability of affordably priced housing from direct damage and the scarcity caused by increased demand, And coastal erosion from sea level rise and storm surge, particularly in areas not protected by coastal wetlands. And then in addition, coastal wetland degradation, oh gosh, I can't talk, sorry guys, from sea level rise and storm surge. Next slide. So the 2022 climate change assessment also looked at regional impacts. Our region today falls into the Cape Islands and South Coast region within that report. And this slide here highlights the outlooks, the climate outlooks for that region. And I specifically want to highlight that 2070, the mid-late century, and the fact that it says that we're 5 times more likely to see that 10% annual chance flood event by 2070. And just so you know, this is the storm event that has a 10% chance of occurring each year. And it's going to be a more frequent storm than what you see on the National Flood Insurance rate maps. And the other thing I want to point out is that by the end of the century, which is that 2090, the tropical cyclone frequency could increase by 50%, leading to more damage from storm surge, heavy rainfall, and high winds. Next slide. So that 2022 climate assessment report also identified urgent impacts for the state as a whole. And these included damage to buildings from heavy rainfall and overwhelmed drainage systems, reduction in state and municipal revenues, including a reduction in property tax base due to coastal and inland flood risk, and reduction in the availability of affordably priced housing from the direct damage and the scarcity caused by increased demand. And as you notice, these are very similar to the impacts that we've already discussed. Next slide. In addition, Resilient Mass identified inland flooding as the most significant climate hazard in Massachusetts. They also identified environmental justice and priority populations live near commercial and industrial buildings that have a 57% higher risk of flood damage than the rest of the state. And by 2070, Massachusetts is expected to receive 12 to 42% more winter precipitation. And the frequency and intensity of precipitation events is also increasing. So as you can see through all of this, we are anticipating larger and more frequent flood events. Next slide. So the third criteria is that all the actions have to improve local floodplain management regulations. So when considering improvements, we looked for options that reduce flood damage and reduced risk. We determined that regulating development was not the only way to reduce flood damage and risk, and that there was administrative options such as improving compliance using incentives, exemptions, and other options that also encouraged flood risk reduction. Next slide. And lastly, all actions had to be justifiable and appropriate for Massachusetts municipalities. It was determined to be justified and appropriate if it was identified in publication review multiple times, if the project subject matter experts have seen it work in the past, and if the National Flood Insurance Program community rating system awards points for the activity. So a couple notes on CRS. This is a federal program that discounts flood insurance premiums for NFIP participating communities. So remember, it's a voluntary action to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And if you participate in CRS, that's also voluntary. So this program provides discounts that are based on gaining points for floodplain practices that are beneficial in reducing flood damage to structures. If the federal government is awarding points, it was determined that it had already been evaluated and found to be beneficial to reducing risk and added to the action list. Next slide. So now we're going to get into the actions. Now I'm going to note a few things. We're not going to present all the actions that were found in that publication review. That list will be provided to you with that survey, so you can see everything that's been pulled forward. And they're also not listed in any particular order. I have just put them in an order that makes it easier for me to present to you today. So this group here is limitations and restrictions, and it's exactly how it sounds. We're going to look at options or actions in this group that limit or restrict what is done in the floodplain. Next slide. So the three options we're going to look at in this section here is restrictions based on depth and velocity, limiting development within the flood zone and or floodway, and limiting fill within the flood zone. Next slide. So the deeper the flow and the faster it's moving, the more damage that will occur and the more likely structures will be swept off of their foundations. So here's an example from the Australian Disaster Resiliency Handbook. They looked at depth and velocity as a function and assigned hazard classifications from H1, which is generally safe for people and structures, to H6, where all building types are vulnerable to failure during a flood event. So now this is a pretty detailed example, and communities typically choose to limit development in areas where the flood depths are greater than 4 to 5 feet or velocities are greater than 8 to 10 feet per second. Next slide. Another option would be to limit development within the flood zone and or the floodway. The floodway, again, is that area that's typically the most dangerous. So it's going to have the deepest flow typically and the fastest flow. So some communities prohibit new structures for human habitation in the floodway, and sometimes they actually limit it in the flood zone as well. Another action would be to prohibit certain types of development or activities. Examples would include septic systems, critical facilities, and manufacturing or storage of hazardous materials. And just a note here, critical facilities is typically defined as infrastructure critical to the health, safety, and welfare of the public. This would include police stations, fire stations, senior living centers, hospitals, those things that we need to have constant access to, even during a flood event. Next structure, or next slide. All right, so limiting fill within the flood zone. This could be prohibiting the use of fill to elevate buildings. And as you can see from the figures, fill always takes up more area from the floodplain than other building options. And this reduces the flood conveyance, increasing the depth. So you're going to encroach on that floodplain and it increases depths and it causes that flow to be faster. Communities can also regulate the content and the compaction of fill to ensure it will hold up to future use of the buildings it was placed to support. So this is making sure that, you know, flood events won't erode the foundations or create damage to the foundations, that the soil is compacted to a place that it'll stay. And lastly, communities can regulate the percent of each lot that can have fill placed on them. And this has to do with that encroachment again. So if we allow every lot in the floodplain to completely add fill, then you're going to also encroach on the area that can have flow, creating deeper depths and faster flows. All right, so we're going to move into our first group of Menti polls. So if you have a phone handy, or if you want to open another web browser on your computer, you can either scan the QR code with your camera on your phone, or you can type in that www.menti.com and enter the code below, 9270902. Go ahead. And once you get in, give me the thumbs up so we can kind of see how many people have gotten in. Thank you. And I should clarify that thumbs up is actually going to be on the Menti screen, not the one within the Zoom screen. So. All right, our number's still climbing a little bit. We'll wait a little bit longer here to let everyone get in. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And you can keep getting in. If you guys are still working on it, just keep going through it. Again, that's www.menti.com, and the code is at the very top of this slide here. So, all right, our first question today is, which options do you think would have the greatest impact to your community? So that restrictions based on depth and velocity, limiting development within the flood zone and or the floodway, or limiting fill within the flood zone. So go ahead and respond. on your screen and then hit submit. And then once you hit submit, give me that thumbs up to let me know that you are done. And there is no right and wrong answers. So these will be used when we go to determine what kind of options or actions to put in that action guide. And so that's why we're asking for your input on these here as we go through these. All right. Be a few more seconds. Got our 18. Next slide. All right, so for this one, which options do you think are the most feasible? And feasible, define it for what your position is. Is it feasible for administration, feasible for outreach, feasible for whatever it is that you do within the floodplain management realm? Don't forget to give me that thumbs up when you're done and hit submit once you have something selected. All right, a few more seconds, and we'll move on. All right, next slide. Using one or two words, what would you like to see restricted in the floodplain? Now for this one, you can submit as many as you want. So go ahead and type that in there, hit submit, and then you can type another one, hit submit. And then when you're done adding any more, just give me that thumbs up. And don't be afraid of giving me the same answer as somebody else, because the word will get bigger than as many times as it gets entered, if that makes sense. So we'll know that those are the options that multiple people are inputting. Lots of good ones, guys. Thank you. Nice. All right, we're gonna give you guys a little bit more time and then we'll go on. So get those last few in and we'll move forward. And then remember to give me that thumbs up so I know that you're done. All right, next slide. All right, zoning bylaws. So these are exactly what you're thinking. These would be actions that could be added to your zoning bylaws. Next slide. We're going to talk about 5 in this section. We're going to talk about flood hazard setbacks, dry land access, protecting new buildings from local drainage, low impact overlay districts, and adopting additional flood risk maps. Next slide. So flood hazard setbacks are to prohibit or limit development within a specified distance from a flood zone or a property boundary or other established line for the purpose of reducing flood risk. The setback adds a margin of safety, guiding development away from the high-risk area. It is important to note that setbacks can be often paired with other options, such as special permits and incentives, and we'll touch on these later in the presentation. Next slide. Dry land access is an action that relates to the ability to access habitable buildings during flood conditions. Without dry land access, occupants can be trapped and unable to reach safer areas. It also allows for the passage for emergency responders during these flood events. Now, these regulations could regulate access all the way to the front door, or it could be to just the street in front of the property. Next slide. Protecting new buildings from local drainage. It is to protect all structures from local drainage by requiring all new buildings to have the first floor a specified measurement above the adjacent grade or crown of the nearest road. This one is unique, and that is for all structures, community-wide, regardless of the flood zone. And as you can see on the slide, more than 20% of NFIP claims are outside of the flood zone. In March of 2010, the Boston metro area had an event where 93% of claims were outside of the flood zone. So this option would just add an extra level of protection to all structures, again, regardless of the zone within your community. Next slide. Low impact overlay districts are low impact uses with minimal impact to the function of the floodplain or minimal encroachment to the floodplain. It shifts the high risk development, structures, people away from the flood zone by controlling the allowed uses in the overlay district. Low impact uses include agriculture, conservation, parks, ball fields, low density residential, and impervious surface restrictions. Next slide. The last one for zoning bylaws is adopting additional flood risk maps. This allows communities to manage known risks by adopting them as high-risk zones and regulating them like flood zones. The maps could include erosion zones, future mapping conditions, sea level rise mapping, surge maps, pluvial mapping, inundation mapping, just to name a few. All right, next slide. All right, so we're gonna go into our second set of Menti polls. And this first one is, which options do you think would have the greatest impact to your community? Is it flood hazard setbacks, dry land access, protecting new buildings from local drainage? Remember, that's for all structures, regardless of flood zone. Low impact overlay districts, and adopting additional flood risk maps. Looks like almost everyone's responded. We'll give you a few more minutes to get that in. And don't forget to give me that thumbs up. All right, next slide. So what options do you think are most feasible? And again, define feasible for your position within floodplain management. Is it flood hazard setbacks, dry land access, protecting new buildings from local drainage, low impact overlay districts, or adopting additional flood risk maps? All right, our answers are slowing down. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this next set is policies and procedures, and these would be things that help with the administration of the flood zone. Next slide. We're going to look at 3 of these today. We're going to look at using FEMA certificates, such as the elevation certificate and the dry floodproofing certificate. We're going to look at using non-conversion agreements for enclosures under elevated buildings with deed restriction. And we're going to look at interlocal agreements for administration. Next slide. So this first one is to require the use of FEMA elevation and dry floodproofing certificates. By requiring these certificates, it ensures that all the necessary information is to verify compliance is included, and requiring them, it allows the administration to know exactly where to look for the information. Next slide. Non-conversion agreements for enclosures under elevated buildings with deed restriction. So this would be before the certificate of occupancy can be issued, the property owner with structures with enclosures would be required to sign the non-conversion agreement. This agreement would outline the allowed uses for the enclosure, which is limited to building access, vehicles, parking, and storage. The non-conversion agreement is then recorded with the property deed to inform future owners of the use limitations of the enclosure. Now, communities could also include language in the non-conversion agreement that allows for periodic inspections of the enclosure to ensure compliance for the life of the structure. Next slide. All right, so the last one for this section is interlocal agreements for administration of flood management bylaws. This allows a number of communities to work together to review permit applications for the region. An example would be in Massachusetts is the Franklin County Council of Governments, where they share a local building official across the multiple communities. Next slide. All right, so of the policy and procedure ones we presented, which one do you think would have the greatest impact to your community? Would it be using the FEMA certificates, elevation certificate, and the dry floodproofing certificate, instilling non-conversion agreements for enclosures under elevated buildings with that deed restriction, or interlocal agreements for administration? All right, next slide. And if you lost your connection, you can go back to the website and just use that code and you'll pick up where you left off. So, okay, so what options do you think are feasible? Is it the certificates, the non-conversion agreements, or interlocal agreements? And out of curiosity, if you could use your Zoom now instead of the Menti, can you give me a thumbs up on the Zoom if you have any of these in place already in your community? All right, next slide. All right, so our last section today is incentives, exemptions, and other tools. These are actions that are voluntary, but lead to reduction in flood risk. Next slide. Now, I don't have specific slides for each of these, but these could include freeboard incentives. So the higher you build, the lower the permit fee. Special permits such as density bonuses, so allow greater density on a site in return for additional open space on another site. Flexibility with setbacks and frontage requirements, allowing higher height limits for elevated buildings. It also could include exemptions or streamlined approvals. So alternate procedures for permitting or site plan reviews. It can include tax benefit or rewards, such as tax incentives, conservation easements, floodplain and drainage easements. It could include a elevation grant assistance program. This would be a community program to help with the writing of grants to elevate and or retrofit homes to make them more resilient to flooding, or other tools such as point systems or cluster subdivisions. Next slide. An example in Massachusetts is the Town of Hull's Elevation Incentive Program. The Town of Hull came up with this incentive to encourage property owners to build higher than the state building code since they could not require it locally. They provide a $500 reduction in permit fees for elevating a structure above the state requirement for the flood zone. And since enacting the incentive program in 2009, up to 80% of permit requests have qualified for the credit, providing more safety for their property during storms and floods. Next slide. All right, so out of incentives, exemptions, and other tools, which do you think would have the greatest impact to your community? Is it freeboard incentives, special permits, exemptions, or streamlined approvals, tax benefits or rewards, an elevation grant assistance program, or are there other tools that we should explore? All right. Don't forget to hit submit and then give me that thumbs up, guys. Looks like we have a few more to come in. All right, next slide. Of these options, which ones are more feasible? And again, define feasible for your position. Is it freeboard incentives, special permits, exemptions or streamlined approval, tax benefits and rewards, or elevation grant assistance or other tools? All right, next slide. All right, so we have a couple final poll questions, and then we'll just take some question and answers from you guys. So next question, or next slide. What types of options are you in favor of? Rank them in order of preference. So the first one's the most favorable, and 4 is the least favorable. So on your screen, you're actually just going to press and pull them up, and then you can put them in the order that you like once you put them on the top. And again, these are the different areas that we looked at. So restriction and limitations, zoning bylaw actions, policy and procedure actions, or incentives, exemptions, and other tools. And once you're done, remember to hit submit, and then you can give me a thumbs up. All right. Looks like we have a few more to come in. We're almost there. All right, go ahead and hit that next slide. So what options and examples were not included in today's presentation that you would like to see covered in the guide? And again, you can submit as many responses as you want. Lots of good ones. Thank you, guys. And they're all unique so far. Lots of good ones. I'm gonna give you guys some more time, but as you think you're done, will you make sure to give me that thumbs up so it'll key me in when to move on? Thank you. All right. Almost everyone's given me a thumbs up and I don't see anything else. So let's go to the next slide. All right, that was the end of Menti, so you can put that away if you want. Next slide. And really now it's just to take any questions you may have. You can put questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. Or just comments, just anything you want to talk about here. Hey, Shannon, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi. So since we're all coastal communities here, I'm wondering if you'll be talking any more specifically about using fill in coastal communities because we tend to get pushback from engineers about, it's affecting the whole Atlantic Ocean, so it doesn't really make a difference. And that's something we're certainly struggling with on the Cape and working on some of our own bylaws. And it'd be great to have guidance from the state on ways we can limit fill in the coastal floodplain, which will be a little more effective against that argument from engineers.
Right. I don't have anything today, but we'll make sure to get that in the guide. I'm fairly certain that's one that will make it in the action guide. But that's a really good point. And actually, I kind of thought about that as I was preparing for today, of just how does that change a little bit? I'm an engineer by profession. And so definitely went across my mind of just, other than erosion and stuff like that, I mean, those are huge pieces on the coast that are huge players for why not to use fill, and why I would definitely personally go with other options. But yes, we will make sure to get those in there. And I think one of the things we really want to add in that guide is kind of too the things to think about, you know, not just like do it, but here's some other things that go with this option. And so we'll try to get some of those arguments in there for locals so that they know how to handle those. So yeah, thank you. All right, we got a comment that says, can zoning bylaws require floodproofing without conflicting with the state or with the building code jurisdiction over construction methods and materials? I don't believe it can. So I think floodproofing is completely within the state building code, but this would be one of those things that could be added as one of those voluntary actions. So that last slide that we talked about, incentives, exemptions, and stuff like that. Please distinguish fill in the coastal floodplain from the beach and the dune nourishment. Okay, other things we'll consider in the guide. Thank you. Other comments? Writing some notes for my stuff. Okay. Oh, floodproofing, it can be done via an overlay. Good to know. Thanks, Julie. Hi, Heather.
Hi there, Katie. Thanks for bringing this to this group and asking these questions. I guess I just wanted to comment that I understand the use of the Mentimeter to sort of take a pulse of this group and get some feedback, but I guess I felt, you know, with any survey, like, I don't want to answer the question that way. So my main point here is maybe just that where you asked about the feasibility of some of these options, a good question to ask, but that also might not suggest that, you know, where there's a preferred method, that it might not be worth trying to make that work, even if it seems less feasible. So I guess just as you prepare the guide, keep in mind that there are things that may be worth pursuing with additional resources to actually adopt a zoning bylaw or, you know, wetlands regulations or whatever it might be.
Very good. And just so you know, Heather, the survey will allow you to put a lot more input into it so that you can clarify kind of what your thoughts were.
Great.
This was just so that we can get people to kind of participate, but you're right, it doesn't really allow you to answer it exactly how you want. And so that survey will allow you to do that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Any other comments or questions? Could there be a discussion about flood barriers and other ways to protect harbors? So flood barriers and other ways to protect harbors. Yeah, I mean, are you talking like within the plan or today? Do other people have some comments on that they would like to share? All right. And Thaddeus, for that in the guide, if it makes it to the action guide, we'll make sure that we have a point in there for coastal versus barriers that are done inland. You know, flood barriers could be for protecting Again, a barrier is going to have a defined line. So if there's like a line for the beach, you could call that your barrier, and then everything behind that has to be developed a certain distance. There's ways to do it. It's just very specific to where you're at and what that location looks like. So Rebecca says you can't put a requirement in any building. Oh, it moved on me. I can't find it. Just a sec. See, you can't put a requirement in any local bylaw that conflicts with the state building code. So I think what she's saying is that if it's allowed in the code, we can't restrict it with an overlay. Is that what we're getting at? I think. Right. How do you intend on engaging building officials who are on the front lines for this topic, but aren't necessarily forward thinking like many? Oh, sorry, it just moved to me. Many of the planners on this Zoom meeting. So like I hinted at the beginning of the presentation, there is a specific project that's being completed for looking at options in regard to the state building code. And I do know that there is intentional engagements with just the state building code officials for those engagements. So that's one way that they are being brought into this project. So the project's kind of twofold, right? We have this community bylaw part that we're looking at today, and then there's a state building code piece that's also being looked at. All right, so Julie says, of course, not conflicting with that state building code, but limitations can be placed that don't conflict. Conservation law has already looked into this, and Boston has made significant changes. Michelle says, is there a timeline or time frame when the guide might be published? So we are looking at springtime probably for it to be published. We will take all the feedback from these engagement sessions. We've had 4. This is our last one. And from there, we will take all those results from the Menti pools, and then we'll wait for probably another 30 days to get all the survey stuff. So I really promote and encourage you guys to fill out the surveys to give me more information of what you want to see. The survey that goes out will include a complete list of the actions that have been pushed forward, so you can kind of see what's already on there. Like I said, today we only looked at a sampling of those options, but there's quite a bit more on the actual list. And then we'll compile which ones that will move forward. The project management team will determine which ones will move forward into the action guide, and then we will start working on that. So the survey will be sent out via email. So the email that you use to register for the Zoom meeting today, that's the email that will get the survey. All right. Great comments and discussion. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about? Any more comments? All right. Well, I'm going to stay on until the last person's on, but if you would like to leave, I will end the formal presentation now. And thank you again for attending, and we look forward to hearing more from you guys through the survey.